The dining salon of the Stella Maris exuded the rare elegance only the finest ocean liners could muster. Crystal chandeliers, swaying gently with the Mediterranean's rhythm, pristine white linens adorned with gleaming silver, and the soft hum of cultured conversation rising above the distant pulse of engines. As the ship glided away from Naples, twinkling lights on that October evening in 1936, I marveled at how Hercule Poirot had chosen his restorative cruise with his usual precision. "Mon ami Hastings," he declared earlier, adjusting his impeccably waxed mustaches with satisfaction. "The little gray cells, they crave the sea, pa and the cuisine of the Stella Maris Magnifique." As we took our seats at the captain's table that first evening, I could see was in his element, his egg-shaped head swiveling, those keen green eyes cataloging our fellow passengers with the meticulous care of a naturalist studying rare specimens. Captain Dubois, a distinguished Frenchman, presided with quiet authority, his weathered hands moving with practiced grace as he gestured toward the approaching courses, his dark eyes sharp with the alertness of one accustomed to bearing the weight of others' lives. "Gentlemen," Captain Dubois said, nodding to Poirot and me, "may I present our fellow passengers? Lady Cordelia Finch, recently returned from archaeological pursuits in Greece." Lady Finch offered a regal nod. Nearing 50, her prematurely silver hair was swept into an elegant chignon, her ink-stained fingers betraying her scholarly devotion. Her evening dress, though exquisitely tailored, bore the subtle wear of careful economy, hinting at diminished fortunes nobly born. "Professor Alistair Jones of Oxford," the captain continued, indicating a thin, precise man whose wire-rimmed spectacles glinted under the chandelier's glow. "The professor specializes in Mediterranean history, I believe late Roman and Byzantine periods. Primarily, indeed," Jones replied, his cultured voice carrying the measured cadence of the lecture hall. He adjusted his spectacles with a nervous twitch, though I confess a broader interest in the region's less documented periods. The captain's introductions were cut short by a theatrical throat clearing from the table's far end. All eyes turned to a striking figure of American opulence, large, florid gentleman, whose diamond shirt studs flashed with every emphatic gesture. "Silas K. Vance," he announced, half rising with grand ceremony, "of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and currently engaged in the most significant archaeological discovery of the modern age." Miss Evelyn Hallway, seated beside him, visibly flinched at her employer's bombast. Quietly pretty, she seemed to shrink from the spotlight his words cast. Woman of perhaps 30, with soft brown hair and an air of perpetual anxiety that seemed to intensify whenever Mr. Vance spoke. Her evening dress was elegant beauty understated, and she clutched a small beaded reticule as though it contained her entire worldly securitimus. Vance Puo said with polite interest, "You speak of archaeology. Fascinating. You are perhaps excavating in this region." Vance's eyes gleamed with the fervor of the true enthusiast. "Better than that, my foreign friend. I amen. The verge. The very verge, mind you, of uncovering the legendary Sapphire Scion of Sorrento." The effect of this announcement was immediate and varied. Lady Finch's fork paused halfway to her lips, her expression sharpening with unmistakable interest. Professor Jones made a small sound that might have been scholarly derision, while Miss Hale's cheeks flushed pink with what appeared to be mortification. "The Sapphire Scion, Lady Finch?" inquired, her voice carefully modulated. "How extraordinary. I was not aware that particular legend had any basis in historical fact," Vance declared, warming to his the methods. "Precisely what makes this discovery so remarkable for begging your pardon, Professor, have dismissed it as mere folklore, a magnificent sapphire supposedly hidden by the old Italian nobility during some long forgotten crisis lost to time and treasure hunters' dreams." Professor Jones suggested his spectacles with a quick, precise movement. "The documentation for such claims is typically, shall we say, unreliable," he said mildly. "Local legends, after Nimblich, quite ordinary events into romantic fantasies. Unreliable Vance's voice rose indignantly. My dear professor, I have spent 3 years and a considerable fortune tracking down documents that would make your academic heart race maps, letters, even a cipher key, all pointing to a location near Sorrento that has never been properly searched. Captain Dubois had been observing this exchange with the detached interest of a man accustomed to shipboard dramaticue. Carry these documents with you, Monsieur Vance. He inquired. Every precious piece, Vance replied, patting his breast pocket, meaningfully including items acquired just this afternoon in Naples from a dealer who didn't realize their significance. Why? I have here a carved wooden bird that may well be the final piece of the puzzle. Miss Hale's reticule slipped from her nervous fingers, clattering to the floor. As she bent to retrieve it, I noticed that her hands trembled slightly when she straightened. Her pale face had taken in an almost greenish tinge. Perhaps Mr. Vance, she murmured, the other passengers would prefer to discuss their own travels, but Vance was not to be deterred with Ashaman's instinct for his audience. He withdrew from his pocket a small object wrapped in tissue paper. Even Poirot leaned forward with interest as Vance carefully revealed a wooden bird carved with intricate detail and darkened with age. Appears quite ordinary, doesn't it? Vance asked triumphantly. But according to my research, this particular type of carving was used by certain Italian families as a wealthy test, say, as a guide to hidden treasures. The dining salon seemed to have ground quieter around our table, though perhaps that was merely my imagination. Lottie Finch's blue eyes were fixed on the wooden bird with an intensity that struck me as peculiar. While Professor Jones had gone quite still, his food forgotten before him, Poirot's own reaction was characteristically measured. A slight tilting of his magnificent head, a barely perceptible narrowing of high size. When he spoke, his voice carried that particular tone I had learned to associate with his growing interest in a puzzle. Most intriguing, Monsieur Vance, he said quietly, and you believe this artifact will lead you to your sapphire? I'm certain of it, Vance declared, carefully rewrapping the bird and returning it to his pocket. Tomorrow, when reach calmer waters, I intend to spend the day correlating my maps with his final clue. By the time we dock in Alexandria, gentlemen, I expect to have pinpointed the exact location of Thegriata's treasure discovery since Howard Carter opened Tutankhamun's tomb. Silence that followed this pronouncement was broken only by the gentle clink of crystal and the distant sound of the ship's orchestra beginning their evening performance. As the conversation gradually turned to safer topics, I noticed that Poirot continued to observe our dinner companions with that peculiar emphasis that always preceded his involvement in matters far more complex than they initially appeared. How prophetic those possessions would prove to be, I could not then imagine. Chapter 2. The Locked Room Discovered. Chapter 2. The Locked Room. Discovery was awakened the following morning, not by the gentle Mediterranean sun filtering through my porthole, but by the most extraordinary commotion in the corridor. Outside my cabin, sharp, urgent voices carried through the walls of the Stella Maris, punctuated by head, sounded distinctly like a woman's distress, hastily donning my dressing gown. I emerged to find the passageway in a state of considerable agitations. Several passengers had gathered near the far end of the corridor, their faces bearing that peculiar mixture of curiosity and alarm that accompanies unexpected drama. Aboard ship, at the center of the group, stood Miss Evelyn Hale, her normally composed demeanor. Entirely, he won't answer, she was saying to uniformed steward, her voice rising with each word. I've been knocking for nearly 10 minutes, and the door is locked from the inside. The steward, a competent-looking young man whose morning efficiency had clearly been disrupted by this crisis, shook his head gravely. Miss, if you're certain that gentleman is inside. Of course I'm certain. Miss Holloway's hands fluttered helplessly. Mr. Vance Always is at 7. Precisely. He ordered his breakfast for 7, and when came to review his schedule, her voice broke slightly. The breakfast tray is still outside his door, untouched. I noticed Poirot's familiar figurine merging from his own cabin. impeccably dressed. Despite the early hour, his sharp green eyes took in the scene with that particular intensity I had learned to recognize, and he moved through the gathered passengers with the quiet authority of a man accustomed to taking charge of unusual situations. That was Poirot addressed. "Miss Hale." Gently, "You are perhaps concerned for your employer's health, miss." Hale turned toward him with obvious relief. "Oh, Poirot, yes, I'm dreadfully worried. You see, Mr. Vance suffers from a weak hearthis. Physician in Philadelphia warned him about overexertion last night after dinner. He was so excited about his research, he stayed up quite late, going through his papers. The door, it is definitely locked from within." Poirot inquired of the steward. "Yes, sir," the young man replied. "I've tried my master key, but the bolt is thrown from the inside. Captain Dubois has been subpoenaed. Dr. Rickenbach is on his way." As if conjured by this mention, Captain Dubois appeared at the end of the corridor, his morning uniform crisp and his expression stern with the weight of shipboard responsibility. Behind him followed a distinguished gentleman, whom I recognized as the ship's physician, a German doctor with silver hair and the confident bearing of long medical experience. "What is the situation, Captain?" Dubois demanded briskly. The steward quickly explained the circumstances, while Reichenbach examined the locked door with professional thoroughness. The physician's weathered hands traced the door frame and tested the handle with gentle persistence. "We shall have to force entry," Dr. Reichenbach announced after his examination. "If the gentleman is indeed suffering from a medical emergency." Captain Dubois nodded grimly and moaned to able seamen from the ship's crew. Within moments, the sound of splintering would echo through the corridor as they applied their shoulders to the resistant door. The lock gave way with a sharp crack, and the door swung inward to reveal the interior of Mervance's luxurious first-class cabin. The sight that greeted us was both shocking and puzzling in equal measure. Silas K. Vance lay sprawled beside his mahogany writing desk, his large frame twisted at an awkward angle that spoke eloquently of sudden collapse. His face bore the purple complexion that I had learned to associate with apoplexy, and his bulging eyes stared sightlessly at the cabin's ornate ceiling. But it was the condition of the cabin itself that struck me as most extraordinary. Papers lay scattered across every surface, maps, photographs, handwritten notes, and typed documents. A veritable blizzard of research materials. Books had been pulled from their shelves and lay open at seemingly random pages. The esca drawers hung open like gaping mouths, their contents spilled across the Persian carpet. Hercule Poirot carefully into the chaos. "The poor gentleman, he has been searching for something." With great urgency, Dr. Rischbach knelt beside the body with professional efficiency, his fingers seeking pulse points and examining the obvious symptoms. Miss Hale remained in the doorway, her face pale as parchment, one hand pressed to her mouth in obvious distress. "Apoplexy," the doctor announced after several minutes of examination, almost certainly brought on by overexertion and excitement. "The gentleman's heart has simply given way under the strain." Captain Dubois surveyeth disordered cabin with the practical eye of a man accustomed to shipboard emergencies. Clearly, he was engaged in intensive work when the attack occurred. He observed Fairroom shows signs of frantic activity. I found myself nodding in agreement with this obvious assessment, but I noticed that Poirot had moved to examine something near the deceased man's outstretched hand, crouching with characteristic precision. My friend studied a small object that lay just beyond Vance's fingertips. "The wooden bird," I said, recognizing the carved artifact from the previous evening's dinner. "Conversation presses on," Poirot replied softly. "Most curious, is it not, that this should be the final object to hold Monsieur Vance's attention?" Miss Hale stepped forward, tentatively, voice barely above a whisper. "He was so excited about it," she said, hiccup saying, "it was the key to everything, the final piece of his puzzler." Eichenbach had completed his preliminary examination and was gathering his medical bag with the brisk movements of a man eager to conclude an unpleasant duty. "Shall need to complete a more thorough examination, naturally," he informed. Captain Dubois. But I see nothing too august, anything other than natural death. The gentleman's excitement over his treasure. Hunting appears to have proved, quite literally, overwhelming. Captain Dubois nodded and began issuing orders for the proper handling of the deceased. And the ceiling of the cabin, as various officials went about their duties, I noticed that continuous methodical examination of the scattered papers and overturned furniture is something in his expression, a slight furrow of the brow. A barely perceptible lighting around his remarkable green eyes suggested that all was not as straightforward as it appeared. He moved through the chaos with the careful steps of a man reading a complex story, written in the language of displaced objects and scattered documents. When he and rejoined me in the corridor where Miss Hale was providing Captain Dubois with details of her employer's recent behavior. Poirot's face bore that particular expression of thoughtful concentration that I had learned to associate with the early stages of his most challenging cases. The morning sun streaming through thicker portholes illuminated a scene of apparent tragedy, the sudden death of an eccentric treasure hunter, overcome by excitement in the pursuit of his obsession. Yet something in Poirot's demeanor suggested that the true story of Silas Caven's final hours might prove considerably more complex than this simple narrative would suggest. Chapter 3. Interviews in the Mediterranean. Chapter 3. Interviews in the Mediterranean Suns. Stella Morris had settled into her steady rhythm across the Mediterranean by the time Poirot and I established a dorsivus on the Sun's deck. That afternoon, the morning's tragic discovery had cast a pall over the ship's atmosphere. Yet life aboard a luxury liner must continue, and passengers gradually emerged from their cabins to resume the pleasant routines of shipboard existence. Poirot had positioned himself with characteristic precision at a small table beneath a striped awning, where Hercule observed the comings and goings of our fellow passengers, while appearing to do nothing more than enjoy the autumn sunshine. His notebook lay before him, closed but ready, and his green ice mist, nothing of the subtle drama unfolding around us. Mon ami, he said quietly, it is most important that we understand the relationships between our fellow passengers and the late M. Chouin's death aboard ship. It creates a closed circle, n'est-ce pas? And in such circumstances, every detail becomes significant. Lady Cordelia Finch was the first to join us, approaching our table with the measured stride of someone accustomed to making careful decisions. She had exchanged her evening attire for a practical tweed ensemble, and her silver hair was secured against the sea breeze by a silk scarf that spoke of understated elegance. Mr. Dubrow, she said, settling gracefully into the chair he offered. I understand. You have some experience with the irregular circumstance. Captain Dubois suggested I might speak with you about poor Mr. Vance. Madame is most kind. Poirot replied with a slight bow of his head. You were perhaps acquainted with the gentleman before this voyage, lady? Finch shook her head decisively. Indeed, I encountered him for the first time at dinner last evening, though I must confess his mention of Sorrento caught my attention rather forcibly. Poirot's eyebrows rose with polite interest. Ah, you have some connection to that region. My family once held considerable property in the area, Lady Finch explained, her fingers unconsciously worrying the clasp of her handbag. The villa was quite famous in its day, built in the 18th century and maintained for generations. Unfortunately, the costs of upkeep in our modern era trailed off, with the particular dignity of those who have learned to bear reduced circumstances gracefully. And this property, it was sold recently? Poirot inquired gently. 3 years ago. Lady Finch confirmed to an Italian industrialist who wished to convert it to a hotel, a necessary decision, but not an easy one. When Mr. Vance spoke so confidently about hidden treasures in Sorrento, I confess, I felt a rather foolish stab of hope that perhaps some family valuables might have been overlooked during the sale. Pooh, needed sympathetically, a natural reaction. Certainly. But you had no knowledge of this sapphire sign before yesterday evening? None whatsoever. Lady Finch replied firmly. Family legends, Mr. Poirot, are notoriously unreliable. If such a treasure had existed, Surely my ancestors would have discovered it during centuries of residence. Lady Finch excused herself for luncheon. We were approached by Professor Alistair Jones, who emerged from Theshep's library, carrying a leather portfolio that suggested dedicated research in progress. His wire-rimmed spectacles caught the Mediterranean light as he settled into the vacated chair. With academic tragic business about Vance, Professor Jones observed, adjusting his spectacles with that nervous gesture I had noticed the previous evening, though hardly surprising given high excitement and obvious poor health. You found Mr. Vance's theory of conveying? Who asked mildly. Professor Jones made a small sound of scholarly dismissal. Unconvincing is rather charitable. The man was chasing romantic fantasies based on highly questionable documentation. I've spent considerable time studying the historical records of that region. Mr. Poirot and I can assure you that tales of hidden Medici treasures are largely the invention of guidebook writers seeking to attract tourists. Yet you seemed most knowledgeable. A booth area. During dinner, I interjected. Surely not every aspect of Mr. Vance's was without foundation. The professor's response came with the measured cadence of the lecture. All the Mediterranean coast has been thoroughly documented by serious scholars for generations. While there were certainly wealthy families in the region during various historical periods, the notion that significant treasures remained hidden into the modern era is simply archaeological romanticism. Pooh leaned forward slightly. And yet, Masula, Professor, you carry search materials of your own, perhaps your own interest in the region. Academic critic Professor Jones replied quickly, his hand moving protectively toward his portfolio. I'm preparing a paper on late Byzantine influences in Italian coastal architecture. Quite different from treasure hunting, I assure you. Our conversation was interrupted by the appearance of Miss Evelyn Holloway, who approached our table with obvious reluctance. Her morning had clearly been difficult. Her eyes were red-rimmed with weep, and her usually precise appearance showed signs of distress. Mr. Poirot, she said hesitantly, Captain Dubois suggested I should speak with Yao about Mr. Vance's recent behavior as his secretary. I was perhaps more aware than anyone of his preoccupations. Poirot's manner became infinitely banal. Mademoiselle, you have my sincere condolences. It must have been a great shock to discover. It was dreadful. Miss Hale interrupted, her voice catching slightly, but I fear I wasn't entirely surprised. Mr. Vance had become increasingly agitated over the past week. He barely slept, barely ate. This quest office had become an absolute obsession. He spoke to you of his research. Poirot inquired. Miss Hale nodded wearily. Constantly. Every new document, every theory, every wild connection he imagined between historical events and this supposed treasure. He was convinced that his discoveries in Naples yesterday present final breakthrough. He needed the wooden bird. We, among other things. Miss Hale confirmed he purchased several items from various dealers. Maps, manuscripts, that carving. He was absolutely beside himself with excitement, staying up until nearly dawn. Everything with his existing research. Professor Jones had listened to this exchange with obvious skepticism, precisely the sort of amateur enthusiasm that leads to tragic outcomes. He commented the man clearly overextended himself, chasing fantasies. The afternoon progressed. Captain Dubois joined our gathering, bringing with him the professional competence of a man accustomed to managing both vessels and the complex human cargo they carried. His weather-beaten hands moved expressively as he described the ship's security procedures and the movements of passengers during the crucial evening hours. The night stewards report nothing unusual in the first-class section. Captain Dubois informed us Mr. Vance's cabin showed a light until quite late past 2 o'clock, according to the officer on watch. But this was not remarkable, given Miss Holloway's description of his working habits and the morning discovery. Poirot accidentally, consistent with Miss Hale's account. The captain replied, the breakfast steward confirms that Mervance's tray remained untouched outside his door. From 7:30 onward, the door was definitely locked from within. My steward's master key could not turn the bolters. The sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the Mediterranean in shades of gold. And as I reflected on the information we had gathered, each passenger had provided reasonable explanations for their presence aboard ship and their reactions to Vance's dramatic announcements. Yet something in Poirot's demeanor suggested that these surface explanations might conceal more complex truths. The gentle rhythm of the ship's engines continued their steady pulse beneath our feet, carrying us inexorably toward Alexandria, while the mysterious ring Silas Kantz's final hours seemed to deepen rather than clarify with each passing conversation. Chapter 4. Secrets Beneath the Surface. Chapter 4. Secrets Beneath the Surface. Sea. Ship's library proved an ideal sanctuary for private conversation the following morning, its leather-bound volumes and mahogany paneling providing both comfort and discretion. Poirot had requested that Captain Dubois permit us to examine the effects removed from Mr. Vance's cabin, and these now lay carefully arranged upon the library's central table like exhibits in some scholarly display. The wooden bird carving occupied the position of honor at the center of this collection, its dark surface gleaming under the reading lamps. Surrounding it were Vance's maps, his correspondence, several leather-bound notebooks filled with his enthusiastic scroll, and the various antiquarian purchases he had made in Naples. Regard Hastings, Poirot said, lifting the carved bird with infinite care. This little fellow, he's not what he appears to be. Next, Barry examined the object more closely than I had. The previous evidence was indeed beautifully crafted, depicting what appeared to be a small songbird with wings folded close to its body. The wood had been polished to a rich patina, and intricate patterns decorated its surface. It appears to be a rather fine example of local craftsmanship, I observed. I confess, I know little about such things. Ah, but that is precisely the point, mon ami, Hugo replied, turning the carving in his hands. This is not as admirably a simple tourist souvenir. The wood itself, noticed the grain the particular way it has been carved. This suggests considerable age, and these markings, he traced one finger along the bird's surface. They are not merely decorative. I think our examination was interrupted by the arrival of Lady Finch, who entered the library with the purposeful stride of someone seeking information rather than literary entertainment. She paused upon seeing us with Vance's sex spread before us, and I noticed a particular tension in her bearing. Poirot, she said, her voice carefully controlled. I hoped I might have a word with you privately about our conversation yesterday. There are certain details I feel I should clarify. Poirot gestured toward one of the leather armchairs arranged near the library's winds. But certainly, madame, you have remembered something additional about your familiar's connection to Sorrento. Lady Finch settled herself with visible effort at maintaining her composure. Fear I was not entirely forthcoming yesterday, she admitted. When one's circumstances have been reduced, there is a natural tendency toward pride that sometimes obscures the truth. The truth, madame, my family's financial difficulties were far more severe than I indicated. Lady Finch continued, her fingers working nervously at her gloves. The sale of the villa Finch was not simply a matter of convenience. It was absolutely necessary to prevent compound bankruptcy. My late husband's investments had failed catastrophically, and the property represented our final asset of any significance. Poirot's expression remains emphatic, but attentive. This must have been most distressing, certain more than distressing. It was devastating, Lady Finch replied with quiet intent. Lose the family seat accumulated over generations. When Mr. Vance spoke so confidently about hidden treasures in Sorrento, I confess I entertained the wild hope that perhaps something of value had indeed been overlooked, something that might restore at least a portion of what we had lost. And you had made no inquiries yourself regarding such possibilities. Lady Finch's hesitation was barely perceptible, but I noticed it nonetheless. I may have made certain she admitted finally, through antiquarian dealers and local historians. Nothing as dramatic as Mr. Vance's activities, naturally, but her confidence interrupted by the appearance of Miss Hale, who approached our corner of the library with obvious reluctance. The poor woman's distress had not diminished. overnight, and she carried herself with the defeated air of someone overwhelmed bee. Circumstances forgive the intrusion, Miss Hale said quietly, but Captain Dubois suggested I should provide you with any correspondence that might bear upon Mervance's recent activities. She produced from her handbag a small bundle of letters tied with ribbon. These arrived for Mr. Vance during our stay in Naples. She explained he was most secretive about them, which was unusual. Normally, he shared all aspects of his research with tedious enthusiasm. Poirot accepted the letters with interest. You did not perhaps observe the return addresses or the identities of the correspondents. Miss Hale's cheeks flushed slightly. I'm afraid professional curiosity got the better of discretion, she admitted. At least one letter bore the letterhead of a London antiquarian firm, Blackwood and Associates. Another appeared to come from someone in Switzerland, though the handwriting was difficult to decipher. Most interesting, Poirot murmured, examining the envelopes, and M.C. Vance's reaction to these communications senseless, excited, and secretive. Miss Hale replied he spent hours composing replies and seemed particularly anxious about maintaining confidentiality. Even asked me to post his responses from different locations around Naples, which struck me as rather odd at this point. Professor Jones materialized at our table with a silent efficiency. Oh, for man accustomed to libraries, he carried his leather portfolio and wore an expression of scholarly concern that seemed somehow calculated rather than natural. I trust I'm not intruding, Professor, Jones said, adjusting his spectacles in that characteristic gesture. He couldn't help but notice the collection of Mr. Vance's research materials. As a fellow scholar, I wondered if there might be items of legitimate historical interest among his acquisitions. Poirot regarded the professor with that particular intensity. I had learned to recognize you have expertise, perhaps in the authentication of such artifacts. To some extent, Professor Jones replied smoothly, certainly enough to distinguish between genuine historical items and the sort of romantic fabrications that often deceive mature enthusiasts. He reached toward the wooden bird, then hesitated. May I? But of course, Poirot replied, though unnoticed. He observed the professor's handling of the carving with sharp attention. Professor Jones examined the bird with movements that seemed almost too practiced to knowing. His fingers stressed the same patterns that had caught Poirot's attention, and I detected a subtle change in his expression, a momentary tightening around his eyes that suggested recognition rather than scholarly curiosity. Interesting craftsmanship, the professor commented, his voice careful and neutral, though I would hesitate to assign it any great antiquity. Without proper analysis, such carvings have been produced in the region for generations. Techniques change very little over time yet. Surely, Poirot said mildly, Askeler, of your expertise could detect certain indicators of age or authenticity. Proforce. Jones's response came perhaps a fraction too quickly. Without laboratory analysis, any assessment would be purely speculative. The patentation could be artificial lended. The wear patterns deliberately created. Amateur collectors are notoriously susceptible to sophisticated forges. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the library's Persian carpets, I found myself increasingly aware of the undercurrents flowing beneath our civilized conversations. Lady Finch's financial desperation, Miss Hale's revelations about secret correspondence, Professor Jones's oddly rehearsed responses to questions about his expertise. Each element added layers of complexity to what had initially appeared a straightforward case of death. Natural causes. Most intriguing of all was Poirot's growing fascination with the wooden bird, which he continued to examine with the methodical attention of a man reading a particularly hailing text. Whatever secrets the little carving held, I sensed they might prove far more significant than poor Vance had ever imagined. Chapter V. False Channels and Dangerous Water. Chapter 5. False Channels and Dangerous Waters. Third day aboard the Stella Maris dawned with a curious tension that seemed to permeate the very air of the ship. Whether this atmosphere stemmed from the continuing investigation into Mr. Vance's death or from some more subtle shift in the relationships between our fellow passengers. I could not say what. I could observe was that everyone seemed to be watching everyone else, with a wariness that had been absent during our first pleasant evening at sea. I discovered the first concrete evidence of this suspicious behavior, quite by accident, while taking my customary morning constitutional arounds. Promenade deck. As I passed the wireless room, I glimpsed through the open doorway a familiar figure bent over a telegraph apparatus. In earnest conversation with the operator. Lottie Finch appeared to be dictating a message of considerable length and apparent urgency. Her usually compositamian showed signs of strain, and she glanced repeatedly over her shoulder as though concerned about observation. She noticed my presence in the doorway. Her reaction was immediate and telling. "Captain Hastings," she exclaimed, her hand moving instinctively to cover the telegraph form. "How pleasant to encounter you this morning. I was just sending word to my solicitor about some rather tedious extractors." "Of course, Lady Finch," I replied politely, though I could not help noticing that she made no move to continue her transmission while I remained within earshot. "I trust there are no urgent complications requiring your attention." "Nothing that cannot wait until we reach Alexandria," she said with forced lightness, but her fingers drummed nervously against the counter. As chat spoke, I related this curious encounter to Poirot, whom I found in deep contemplation over Vance's effects in the library. My friend's reaction was characteristically thoughtful. "Most interesting, mon ami," he murmured, not looking up from the wooden bird carving he was examining through his magnifying glass. And the lady seemed anxious that her communications should remain private, extraordinarily so. I confirmed Herminer suggested something rather more pressing than routine legal correspondence. Priel set down his magnifying glass with a small sound of satisfaction. "The plotters, they say it thickens. But tell me, Hastings, what do you make of these?" Indicated a section of Vance's cabin inventory that Captain Dubois had provided among the scattered papers and overturned furniture. The ship's officers had noted several items that seemed oddly out of place. Books that had been moved from shelves, but left closed drawers that appeared to have been searched but hastily reorganized, and most peculiarly, a lamp that had been moved from its original position, but carefully replaced. "It suggests," I said slowly, "that Simeona conducted a very methodical search of the cabin before the body was discovered." Poirot exclaimed. "But observe the curious nature of this search, mon ami. It was conducted by someone who wished to examine Monsieur Vance's possessions, but also desired to conceal the fact of having done so. This is not the work of a common thief." Our discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Miss Halowar. Approached our table with an expression of considerable distress. Carried a small leather portfolio, which she placed before Poirot. With obvious reluctance. "Mr. Poirot," she said in a voice barely above a whisper, "I fear I have not been entirely honest about Mr. Vance's recent correspondence. There were other letters that disturbed him greatly." Poirot's manner became immediately attentive. "Letters of what nature, mademoiselle?" Miss Hale opened the portfolio with trembling fingers and withdrew several sheets of paper, threatening letters. She admitted they began arriving about 2 weeks ago, sent to various hotels where we had been staying. Samine was clearly following our movements, and in warning Mr. Vance to abandon his research, leaned forward to examine the documents. She produced. The letters were typewritten on plain paper with Noiden typing marks, but their content was unmistakably menacing phrases like "seashore investigations immediately," and "some secrets are better left buried," leaped from the pages in stark threatening language. "Why did you not mention these before?" Poirot asked gently. "Mr. Vance forbade me to speak of them," Miss Hale replied, her voice growing steadier as she made her confession. "He insisted they were of rival treasure hunters attempting to frighten him away from his discovery, but I could see how that affected him. He became increasingly paranoid and secretive, and the postmarks in these letters." Miss Hale shook her head. "They varied: Rome, Naples, even one from London. Whoever sent them was either traveling extensively or had associates in multiple cities. As we absorbed this troubling information, I noticed through the library's windows that Professor Jones was engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation with two gentlemen I did not recognize. They were clearly second-class passengers, judging by their attire and the section of deck they occupied, yet the professor's manner suggested this was no casual shipboard acquaintance pool. I said, directing his attention to the scene. Observed Professor Jones, rather curious company for an Oxford academic. Wouldn't you say, Poirot? Followed my gazined. Watched as the professor concluded his conversation with a series of sharp nods and handshakes. The two strangers melted away into the crowd of passengers. With the practice seas off, men accustomed to avoiding notice, most illuminating. Poirot murmured, "It would seem that our scholarly professor has interests beyond Byzantine architecture." Remainder of the afternoon brought additional complications that served only to deepen the mystery surrounding Vance's death. Captain Dubois reported that the ship's stewards had noticed several passengers moving about the corridors during the crucial night. Hours movements that could not be accounted for by normal shipboard activities. More disturbing still was the discovery that someone had attempted to access the ship's safeware. Vance's more valuable research materials had been stored for security. The attempt had been unsuccessful, but the scratches around lock mechanism suggested considerable expertise. With such device as evening approached and the Stella Maris continued her steady progress across the darkening Mediterranean, I found myself increasingly bewildered by the multiplying complications. Lady Finch's secretive telegrams, the evidence of a pre-discovery search of Vance's cabin. Professor Jones's mysterious associates, Miss Bay Hale's revelations about threatening letters. Each new development seemed to point in a different direction, yet Poirot appeared oddly satisfied by these very complications that so confused me. He spent the evening hours in his cabin, surrounded by timeline charts and cabin layouts, muttering occasionally in Frenches. He worked through some complex calculation, known only to himself. When I attempted to discuss the various leads we might pursue, he raised one perfectly manicured hand to forestall my suggestions. Non-stinks, he said firmly, the obvious trails. They are precisely what we must not follow in a case such as this, where so many clues present themselves so conveniently. One must ask, we these particular breadcrumbs have been scattered for us to find the ship's engines. Continued their steady thrumming beneath our feet as we sailed deeper into waters that seemed to grow more treacherous with each passing hour, despite the deceptively calm surface of the Mediterranean night. Chapter 6. The Cipher of the Wooden Bird. Chapter 6. The Cipher of the Wooden Birds. Fourth morning, aboard the Stella, Mary found Poirot in a state of intense concentration that I had netto recognized as the precursor to one of his remarkable deductive breakthroughs. Had spent the previous evening in his cabin with the wooden bird, carving a powerful magnifying glass and what appeared to be half the ship's library spread across his writing desk. When I knocked upon his door at our customary break hour, I discovered him still in his dressing gown, surrounded by sheets of paper covered with his precise handwriting and curious diagrams that resembled nothing so much as architectural blueprints. "Ah, mon ami," he exclaimed without looking up from his work. "You arrive at the perfect moment. Come observe this most fascinating discovery." I approached his desk with the caution of a man who had learned that Poirot's enthusiasms often led to complex revelations that challenged everything one had previously believed about a case. The wooden bird sat in the center of his workspace, but now it was accompanied by detailed sketches showing its surface from every conceivable angle. "What exactly have you discovered?" I asked, settling into the cabin's second chair. Poirot's green eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of a puzzle successfully solved. "This little bird, Hastings, it is not what any of us believed it to be. Observe these markings upon its surface, which we all assumed to be merely decorative." Indicated his sketches, where he had carefully reproduced every line and groove on the carving surface. What had appeared to be random decorative patterns now showed under his methodical analysis a distinctly purposeful arrange. Notice how these lines intersect at specific points. Poirot continued tracing patterns with his finger, and see here these small indentations shot appear to be natural imperfections. In the wood they are nothing of the sort. They follow a mathematical progression that could not possibly be. Accidentally studied his diagrams with growing amazement. You mean to suggest this is some sort of code? Precisimo Poirot exclaimed, but not merely a code, mon ami, a cipher device. The bird itself functions as a key for decoding other information. One would need both this carving and the code massage to unlock the secret. It protects the implications of this discovery. Struck me immediately. Then Vance's treasure hunt was perhaps not the romantic fantasy we all believed. Poirot finished. If this wooden bird is indeed a cipher key, then Monsieur Vance may have stumbled upon something far more significant than a simple gemstone. Our conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock at the cabin door. Captain Dubois entered at Poirot's invitation, his weathered face grave with concern. Mr. Poirot, the captain said without preamble, we have a problem. Someone attempted to break into the ship's safe during the night. Whose reaction was immediate and intense. The safe containing Monsieur Vance's sex exactly. Captain Dubois confirmed the night watch discovered scratches around the lock mechanism and signs that someone had attempted to force the combination. Nothing was taken, but only because our security measures proved adequate to the calling. I felt a chill of apprehension that had nothing to do with the Mediterranean morning. Somion is desperate to obtain Vance's research materials, or perhaps, Poirot said quietly, his gaze fixed upon the wooden bird. Someone has realized the true significance of this particular item and wishes to prevent us from discovering what they themselves already know. Captain Dubois examined the cipher device with professional interest. You believe this carving is connected to the attempted break-in? I am certain, Poirot replied. But we must ask ourselves why now? What has changed to make immediate action necessary? The answer came to me with sudden clarity. Alexandria. We're approaching the end of the voyage. If someone wants Tote, their opportunities are becoming limited. Exact. Hastings. Poirot's approval was evident. The pressure of time. It forces the hand of our mysterious adversary. But this gives us an advantage. Nespa. Desperate actions often reveal more than careful planning. Captain Dubois assumed his most authoritative manorial double, the guard on the safe, and station additional security in the first-class corridors. But Mr. Poirot, if you're correct about this cipher device, shouldn't we attempt to decode whatever message it's meant to unlock? Poirot carefully lifted the wooden bird, turning it to catch the morning light streaming through the porthole. That Mon Capitan assumes we possess the coded message itself. Monsieur Vance may have found the key, but did he discover what it was meant to unlock? This question occupied our thoughts as we made our way to the dining salon for a late breakfast. The ship's atmosphere had grown noticeably tenser overnight, and I observed our fellow passengers with new attention. Lottie Finch appeared pale and distracted, picking at her food while gazing frequently toward the windows as though calculating our remaining time at sea. Professor Jones maintained his scholar-like composure, but I detected a nervous energy in his movements that had not been present on previous mornings. Most telling of all was Miss Hale's behavior. The poor woman seemed on the verge of collapse, her hands trembling as she attempted to manage her morning correspondence. One Poirot approached her table with polite inquiries about her welfare. Her reaction was startling. Mr. Poirot, she said in a voice barely above a whisper, I'm beginning to fear that Mr. Vance's death may not have been natural tragedy. We all assumed Poirot's expression became immediately grave. What causes you to think so? Mademoiselle Miss Hale glanced around the dining salon with obvious anxiety before responding. Searched through my cabin last night while I was at dinner. Nothing was taken, but my papers had been disturbed. Me. Correspondence examined. Whoever did this was looking for something specific. Did they find what they sought? I don't believe so, Miss Hale replied, but only because I'd already given you the threatening letters Mr. Vance received. I fear There may be other documents, other secrets, that I know nothing about us. The morning progressed, and the ship continued its steady approach. Toward Alexandria, I found myself increasingly aware of the charged atmosphere that seemed to envelop our small community. Office incidents, the attempted safe break-in, the search of Mrs. Hale's cabin, and Poirot starting discovery about the cipher device had transformed what had initially appeared to be a tragic but straightforward death into something far more complex and potentially dangerous. Most unsettling of all was the growing certainty that someone among our seemingly civilized company possessed the knowledge and the desperation necessary to commit murder for whatever secrets the wooden bird might unlock. AZ Egyptian coast grew visible on the horizon. I realized that our time for uncovering the truth was growing as limited as our mysterious adversaries. Opportunities for further mischief. Chapter 7. Dangerous Revelation. C. Chapter 7. Dangerous Revelations. Afternoon of our 5th day aboard the Stella Maris brought with it an atmosphere of barely contained tension that seemed to affect every corner of the ship. The Egyptian coastline had grown steadily more distinct through the morning, and the knowledge that our voyage would soon conclude appeared to have triggered a sense of urgency among our fellow passengers that manifested itself in nervous glances, who shed conversations, and a general restlessness that even the ships experienced. Crew had begun to notice Poirot had spent the morning hours in intensive examination of Vance's remaining papers, cross-referencing the wooden bird's cipher patterns with various documents from the dead man's collection. His concentration was so complete, Fath barely acknowledged my presence when I joined him in the library, where he had spread his materials across 3 separate tables. Mon ami, he said without looking up from his work, I begin to suspect that Pormsavault stumbled upon something far more dangerous than any treasure of precious stones. What do you mean? I asked, settling into a nearby chair. Worrell indicated a series of documents arranged in chronological order. Observe these letters and maps. Hastings, they appear to trace a historical mystery spanning several decades, but not the romantic tale of hidden gems that Monsieur Vance believed himself to be. He could elaborate further. Our conversation was interrupted by the sudden appearance of Miss Hale, who burst into the library in a state of extreme agitation. Her face was flushed with exertion. NJ clutched her handbag as though it contained her very life. Mr. Pure, she gagged. You must help me, Samayon. Just tried to push me over the ship's railing. The effect of this announcement was immediate and electrifying. Poirot sprang to his feet with an agility that belied his normally precise movements, while I felt my blood run cold at the implications of her words. Mademoiselle, are certain of this? Poirot demanded, his green eyes sharp with concern. Absolutely certain, Miss Hale replied, her voice trembling. I was walking along the promenade deck near the stern when someone approached from behind. They didn't speak, but suddenly I felt hands supine my back, pushing me toward the railing. If another passenger hadn't appeared at that moment. You saw Hotact, you? I interjected. Miss Hale shook her head in frustration. The person was wearing a heavy coat with the collar turned up and moved away too quickly when the other passenger arrived. But Poirot, I'm convinced this is connected to Mr. Vance's death. Someone believes I know more about his research than I actually do. Poirot's expression had grown increasingly grave during her recital. You must remain in public areas from this moment forward, he instructed firmly, and Captain Hastings will escort you whenever you move about the ship. We are dealing with someone who has moved beyond theft to attempted murder, as we discussed. Security arrangements for Miss Hale's protection. I noticed through the library windows that Professor Jones was once again engaged in conversation with the same mysterious passengers I had observed previously. This time, however, their discussion appeared more heated, with sharp gestures and expressions of obvious disagreement. Poirot, I said quietly, directing his attention to the scene. Our scholarly friend seems to be having difficulties with his associates. Poirot followed my gaze and observed the heated exchange with characteristic intensity. Most illuminating, he murmured. I suspect that recent developments have disrupted certain carefully laid plans. It was then that a steward approached a door table with obvious nervousness, carrying a sealed envelope addressed to Poirot. "Begging your pardon, sir," the young man said, but this was left at the purse surface with instructions for immediate delivery. Poirot accepted the envelope with interest and carefully examined it before breaking the seal. As he read the contents, I observed a subtle but unmistakable change in his demeanor, a tightening around his eyes that suggested both anger and determination. "What is it?" I asked. "A warning," Poirot replayed grimly, handing me the single sheet of paper. "Mon ami, it appears we haven't made someone extremely nervous." The message was brief and typed on the same plain paper as the threatening letters. "Miss Hale had revealed your investigation must cease immediately. Some secrets are worth killing to protect. Consider this your final warning." Miss Hale read the note over my shoulder and went pale. "It's the same person who threatened Mervyn's," she whispered. Poirot agreed, but observed the change in tone. "Mamame, this is no longer about preventing the discovery of a treasure. This concerns secrets that some Ionic insiders, dangerous enough to justify murder." As the afternoon progressed, dissonant incidents confirmed that we were indeed dealing with a desperate adversary. Captain Dubois reported that Samayan had attempted to access the ship's telegraph equipment during the previous night, apparently seeking to send unauthorized communications. More ominously, a thorough search of the ship had revealed that several items from Vance's original collection were missing, not the obvious valuables, but specific documents that appeared to have been selected with expert knowledge. Most alarming development came when I returned to my own cabin to change for dinner. As I opened the door, I was struck immediately by the unmistakable sense that someone had been inside during my absence. Nothing appeared to have been taken, but subtle signs suggested a thorough and professional search. Books were placed in slightly different positions, clothing rearranged with almost imperceptible precision. More unsettling still was the discovery of a small glass vial hidden behind the washstand, containing a clear liquid that possessed no discernible odor but somehow suggested extreme danger. When I brought this find to Poirot's attention, his reaction was immediate and alarming. "Mondore," he exclaimed, handling the vial with infinite care. "Hastings, you have had a most fortunate escape. This substance, I have encountered it before in cases involving the most sophisticated of criminals." "What is it?" "A poison, Monamira, expensive and virtually undetectable by conventional means. It would appear that someone intended to eliminate you as a potential witness to their activities." The full implications of this discovery struck me with chilling force. Someone aboard the Stella Marie possessed not only the knowledge and equipment necessary for sophisticated murder, but also the connections required to obtain exotic poisons and the desperation to use them against anyone who threatened their secrets. As evening approached and theolites of Alexandria grew visible on the distant horizon, the ship had become a floating powder keg of tension and hidden menace. Passengers moved about with obvious unease. Conversations were conducted in hushed tones, and even the normally cheerful crew members went about their duties with watchful expressions. Most disturbing of all was the growing realization that we were running out of time. Within hours, the Stella Mary would dock in Alexandria, and our closed circle of suspects would disperse to the four winds. If Poirot was to solve the mystery of Silas K. Advance's death and prevent further violence, he would need to act with decisive speed. The Mediterranean night closed around us like a dark curtain as the ship's engines drove us inexorably toward a confrontation that I sensed would prove far more dangerous than any of us had initially imagined. Chapter 8. The Truth Unveiled. Chapter 8. The Truth Unveiled. The Grand Salon of the Stella Maris had never seemed more elegant than on that final evening as our ship approached the harbor lights of Alexandria. Crystal chandeliers cast warm pools of light across the assembled passengers, while the gentle rhythm of the engines provided a subtle counterpoint to the tension that filled the ornate room. Captain Dubois had, at Poirot's request, gathered all the principal figures in our mysterious drama for what my friend had termed a final clarification of certain facts. Lady Finch sat with characteristic rigidity in one of the salon's velvet armchairs, her silver hair catching the light as she maintained her composure despite the obvious strain of recent events. Miss Hale occupied a nearby settee, hands folded tightly in her lap and her face bearing the pale exhaustion of Simeon, who had endured more than her share of shocks. Professor Jones had positioned himself near the salon's magnificent windows where the approaching Egyptian coastline provided a dramatic backdrop to his scholarly silhouette. Captain Dubois himself presided over this gathering with the grave authority of a man who understood that serious matters were about to be addressed. His weathered hands rested on the back of a leather chair as he surveyed the assembled company with professional attention to detail. Poirot stood at the center of the salon, immaculate as always in his evening dress, his magnificent mustaches waxed to perfection, and his green eyes bright with the satisfaction of a complex puzzle finally solved. Before him, on Asmode's table, lay the wooden burr, carving several documents from Vance's collection, and what appeared to be Asmode glass. Laboratory slide. Madame's Hercule Poirot began with his theatrical flair. We are gathered tonight to discuss the death of Mosiah Silas K. Vance, which occurred in what appeared to be tragic but natural circumstance. I say appeared, because appearances, as we shall discover, can be most deceptive. Indeed, Lady Finch shifted slightly in her shimmer. Poirot, surely Dr. Reichenbach's examination confirmed that poor Mr. Van died of apoplexy. His excitement over his treasure hunting clearly overwhelmed this weak heart. Ah, Madame, Poirot replied with a gentle smile. But that is precisely what someone wished us to believe. The scene in Monsieur Vance's cabin was most carefully arranged to suggest exactly such a conclusion. Professor Jones adjusted his spectacles with that familiar nervous gesture. I'm not certain I follow your meaning, Poirot. The evidence seemed quite conclusive. Your contra. Professor Jones. Poirot said, his voice taking on a sharper edge. The evidence was indeed conclusive, but not in the way you might expect. You see, I was struck immediately by certain inconsistencies in that chaotic cab paper scattered everywhere. Books pulled from shelves, drawers ransacked, all suggesting frantic searching by a man overcome with excitement. Yet certain details told a different story entirely. He moved to the table and lifted the wooden bird with characteristic precision. This little carving, for instance, which was found beside Monsieur Vance's hand, it appeared to be the final object of his attention, the culmination of his treasure hunting obsession. But observe its position, more carefully placed, just so, as though deliberately positioned for our discovery. Miss Hale leaned forward, anxiously. What do you mean, Mr. Poirot? I mean, Madame Whistle, that this cipher divus for that is what this carving truly represents, was placed beside the body by someone who understood its significance far better than poor Neil Vance ever did. Captain Dubois frowned with obvious concern. You're suggesting the cabin was staged after Mr. Vance's death. Persisted made a crucial error while creating apparent chaos. They could not resist imposing a certain order upon the scene. Books were pulled from shelves, but stacked neatly. Papers were scattered, but remained in recognizable groupings. Thievery, precision of the disorder, betrayed the methodical mind behind it. Professor Jones had grown noticeably still during this explanation. These seemed rather fanciful interpretations of what could easily be natural circumstances. Manon, Professor, or should I say Asian Jones. Poirot's words fell into the salon like stones into still water. For you are not, as you have claimed, a scholar of Byzantine history. Your knowledge of metaphysics is entirely too practical, too specific, too focused upon matters that would concern an intelligence operative rather than an academic researcher. The transformation in Professor Jones was immediate and startling. The nervous scholar vanished by someone whose cold calculation was suddenly visible in every line of his bearing. Oral accusations are absurd, Jones said, but his voice now carried a different qualitatively controlled, professional danger rouser. They indeed, Poirot continued, Let's examine what Monsieur actually discovered and why it cost him his life. Sapphire Scion of Sorrento was never a precious stone. Mesamate was instead a coded diary disguised as a family heirloom, but containing explicit information about political dealings, information that could destroy careers and destabilize governments. Even today, lady. Finch gasped audibly diary, but surely Madame, a document containing the true identities of double agents, the details of secret negotiations, the proof of betrayals that certain parties would kill to suppress, and Monsieur, in his innocent enthusiasm for treasure hunting, had stumbled upon the key to unlocking these dangerous secrets. Bureau indicated the wooden bird with a gesture of elegant precision. This carving is a cipher device designed to decode the information hidden within seemingly innocent documents. Agent Joneshire was dispatched to locate and destroy any trace of these old secrets before they could cause a diplomatic attack. This is complete fantasy, Jones said. Booth's hand had moved almost imperceptibly toward his jacket pocket. Is it Pooh? Asked Edmundly. Then perhaps you can explain your possession of Fish lifted the glass slide from the table, a sample of the rare plant-based poison with which you murdered Monsieur Vincent, introduced into his preferred brand of doing tobacco. It mimicked the symptoms of apoplexy perfectly while remitting Gundical. By conventional examination, Captain Dubois had moved quietly to position himself between Jones and the salon's exit. The game is up, Professor. Mr. Poirot's analysis is supported by evidence we discovered in your cabin this afternoon. Jones, his composure finally cracked entirely. You don't understand the implications, he said. Desperately, those documents could destroy the balance of power in Europe. Vance was a fool who would have published everything for the sake of publicity, and so you killed him, Poirot said. Qualathon arranged his cabin to suggest death by natural causes brought on by treasure hunting. Excitement, but you could not resist. The perfectionists need to organize even apparent chaos, and that precision betrayed Eunice Hale. Stared at Jones with horror and comprehension, threatening letters, the break-in attempts, all to retrieve the cipher device, the device, and any documents that might point to the true nature of the Scion. Poirot confirmed, but Missance's death had already attracted too much attention. Agent Jones found himself trapped aboard this ship with the very evidence he had killed. To suppress us, Captain Dubois summoned his security officers and Jones was led away in restraints. The salon fell into a profound silence, broken only by the distant sound of harbor bells announcing her arrival in Alexandria. The wooden bird remained on its table, uninnocent looking, carving that had concealed secrets dangerous enough to justify murder, and had ultimately revealed the truth that destroyed its guardians. Carefully constructed Facadefi, Stella Maris glided toward her berth as justice, like the dawn breaking over ancient Egyptian coast, finally illuminated the shadows where murder had hidden itself behind the mask of natural death. Outro. Thank you so much for joining me aboard the Stella Maris. Tonight, dear listeners, Shrew would have thought that a simple wooden bird could unlock secrets dangerous enough to kill for, and that a respected professor was actually a deadly intelligence. Operative, I am curious to hear your thoughts. Did you suspect Professor Jones, or were you surprised as Captain Hastings when the truth was revealed? Until our next mystery unfolds,